I'm afraid that capital punishment in America is a necessary evil. It's a sacrifice that we have to make because we live in a free society. There is no ironclad guarantee that this person who goes out and stalks young women or innocent children or what have you and murders them brutally is going to not do that again. The only guarantee we have is, unfortunately, to terminate this individual's existence. The only fitting punishment is capital punishment.
Gary Gilmore, John Spinkelink, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, names that have made headlines in America for one reason. They were executed for crimes society deemed worthy of the death penalty. Since colonial days, the crimes America punishes with death have reflected the social taboos of the times. Watt Espy has spent 17 years chronicling each and every case of capital punishment in the United States since 1608.
In the United States, we've done practically everything except boiling oil. Burnings were very, very commonplace. Generally, they were reserved for slaves. However, there was a white woman burned in Pennsylvania during the colonial period. In many, many of the slave-holding states, slaves administering medicine to an ill master was an offense punishable by death. Massachusetts in the 1650s passed a law making being a Quaker in the colony a capital offense. So 4 people were actually hanged for being Quakers in Massachusetts, which I guess is the most blatant example of religious persecution that we have in the history of this country.
In most states, executions were public events. Invitations like these were sent out to citizens of the community, welcoming them to witness the execution. The reason? Deterrence. This practice continued up until the early 1900s. But America was not alone in this approach to capital punishment. To this day, some countries still use executions as a warning to its people. This scene is in Pakistan. The year is 1971. The man, a rebel, was left tied to a tree to die. This scene is from Vietnam, 1961. These traitors are being shot in front of a crowd. In the United States, public executions occasionally led to violence among the crowd and senseless tragedy for a few unfortunate witnesses.
One of the reasons why the movement began to move executions behind prisons is the effect that it would have on young people. Their parents would take them to witness an execution, thinking that perhaps it would have some salutary effect. They would hold them up so they could get a good glimpse and all of that. But I found, I guess, 30 or 40 cases where after witnessing an execution, a child of tender years would hang a playmate or hang themselves.
The last public execution in America was on August 14, 1936. Nearly 20,000 people showed up to watch the hanging death of Rainey Bethea, a black man accused of raping a white woman.
Well, they sold lemonade on the grounds, and of course the saloons did a bumper business and all of that, and everybody had a good time, and the mob was just totally unruly. And Time magazine had representatives there, as did the New York Times and the international press, and the state of Kentucky was just thoroughly excoriated in the media all over the world.
The carnival atmosphere convinced the Kentucky Supreme Court to put a halt to public executions from then on. The methods America has used to execute its criminals have changed over the years, from burning to drawing and quartering to hanging. Criminals have been axed, crucified, buried alive, pressed with weights, stoned, impaled, starved, decapitated, and gibbeted. Gibbeting is the hanging of the condemned man by chains to rot. Death often takes weeks to occur.
The reason that we started changing the means of execution was supposedly to seek a more humane way. Hanging was a general means of execution up until 1890. Now, hanging was far from perfect. Any number of things could happen. If the drop was not enough, the poor man or woman strangled to death at the end of the noose. We have one case where a man strangled for 53 minutes before he died. The electric chair was the first new innovation that came along. New York adopted it, and in 1890, a man named William Kemmler became the first man to be electrocuted in this country. Now, there was quite a debate between Thomas A. Edison and George Westinghouse over which type current to use. One advocated one and the other the other. I believe they ended up adopting the Westinghouse method. And certainly electrocution was not all that humane. In many, many instances, a man would be pronounced dead and then start breathing and all of that, and they'd have to take him back. I'll cite you one example. The three Van Wormer brothers, who were electrocuted in New York about 1905 for killing their uncle for an inheritance, when the youngest one, who was the last one to be executed, they had them all three in the morgue with the sheets over them, and the youngest one came to and started getting up, and they had to take him back in and electrocute him again.
In 1915, Nevada introduced lethal gas as the preferred mode of execution. Thus, the gas chamber was born.
Their original plan was to asphyxiate the man while he was sleeping, but they decided that that was not feasible because it would constitute a danger to other inmates. So they literally built a cubicle in which to execute him.
Lethal injection has been the most recent development in capital punishment. It was introduced December 7, 1982 in Texas with the death of Charlie Brooks, Jr. But again, there were problems.
Stephen Morin, who was executed in Texas, was strapped on a gurney and held immobile for 41 minutes while they stuck needles in him. They literally stuck needles in his body for 41 minutes trying to find veins strong enough to take the catheter. He had a long history of drug abuse, and it had dried his veins up.
The states of Utah and Idaho still use the firing squad. In fact, in 1608, the first man ever executed was killed by firing squad. Today, the breakdown of execution methods looks like this. 17 states use lethal injection. The electric chair is employed in 15 states. Lethal gas is the choice in 7 states. 3 states still hang their condemned, and 2 states execute prisoners by firing squad. In 1972, the United States Supreme Court ruled capital punishment unconstitutional. At the time, 600 condemned men and women lived on death rows in America. Each one was removed from death row, often to a lesser sentence. One of those who is no longer on death row because of the 1972 ruling is Charles Manson. Manson soared to national prominence in 1969 after the brutal Tate LaBianca slayings in Los Angeles. At the time, he received the death penalty.
I've paid 22 years of my life. You know, I'm the other end of your society. You know, so you can ride your bicycles and do your thing. I live in your reform schools and your orphanages. I'm not against you. I'm not against you. Huh?
Are you bitter?
Bitter? No.
But you feel you paid some price so far in your life.
Price?
To society, you said it.
Yeah, okay.
Does that make you bitter?
I don't know what that means.
How do you feel right now? Do you feel good feelings towards the judge?
I feel a little nervous. A little nervous. I feel good feelings towards everything. I feel no bad. I know no bad.
At California's San Quentin prison, where Charles Manson lives out his life sentence, Dave Lagerman is the public information officer.
He's got a life sentence, life with the possibility of parole. And he'll be going before the parole board again in 89. If he gets out again, he will be the new messiah for a group of individuals out there that are in about their third generation that still think he's pretty neat stuff. You know, there's kids out there that weren't even alive in 1969 that still call me up and write me letters wanting to know all about Charlie. Well, they're still showing reruns of Helter Skelter, and the book's still out there, and unfortunately, we created this cult.
The effects of the court decision were dramatic. In California alone, 197 men sentenced to death were released from death row. Sirhan B. Sirhan, accused of assassinating Robert F. Kennedy, also left death row. He's now serving a life sentence in Soledad. Richard Speck, accused of brutally murdering 8 student nurses, another reduced sentence. He faces parole in 1989. But by 1976, the tide had turned. Headlines like this one from the New York Times told the story. The Supreme Court had reversed its previous decision, declaring capital punishment legal. The mood quickly changed on death row. Then, on January 17, 1977, Gary Gilmore became the first man to be executed in the United States in over 10 years. Gilmore murdered a motel clerk in Provo, Utah. Gilmore insisted on the right to die and stood in front of a firing squad only 2 days after his 36th birthday. Then there was John Spinkling, a 30-year-old work camp escapee who killed his traveling companion over a money dispute. Spinkling got the death penalty in Florida, and on May 25, 1979, he went to the electric chair. His was the first involuntary execution in 12 years. As of 1987, Florida led the nation with 277 inmates awaiting death. Texas was second with 257, and California was third with 219. The youngest person facing death was 16 years old. The youngest person to be executed in recent history was 14-year-old George Stinney, Jr. He was electrocuted in South Carolina in 1944.
He was only 14 years old and a very, very small, frail young man at that, and they absolutely had to make adjustments to the electric chair in order to accommodate his body. Of course, it had been made for adults.
The juvenile death penalty has existed for 3.5 centuries in the United States. In fact, more than 300 juveniles have been executed. And almost 300 women have been executed over the same time, most in Salem. At least 21 women were hanged for witchcraft in Massachusetts.
They would not hang a pregnant woman. Now, a woman could be sentenced to be hanged, but if she was pregnant, they would respite her and spare her life until such time as she bore the baby and then hang her. And consequently, a lot of women who were under sentence of death would get cozy with the jailers and all of that and try to get pregnant before the date of execution.
Velma Barfield was the last woman executed in the United States.
She, like so many of the women who have been executed in the history of the country, there have been about 350 of them, But Velma Barfield, like so many of the women, was a poison murderess. Poison is a woman's tool. Now, don't get me wrong, we've had men use poison as that means of eliminating someone else, but primarily it's a woman's tool, and Ms. Barfield was a poison murderess.
One of the century's most controversial cases was that of Bruno Hauptmann, accused of kidnapping and murdering the baby of aviator Charles Lindbergh. He was sentenced to die in 1936. Today, his widow seeks to have her dead husband pardoned for a crime she and many other experts say he could not possibly have committed. Of course, these are the famous ones, the first, the last, the ones immortalized by the press, by books, and by movies. And with most Americans favoring capital punishment by a margin of 2 to 1, we can only expect more.
People think that these killers on death row are these beetle-browed, hook-nosed ogres, and they disassociate themselves with them, when in reality they look just like everybody else. They come from every imaginable walk of life, and you could take them out, put them in a JCPenney suit on a street corner, you couldn't tell it from anybody else. You know, they're not these strange-looking individuals. They're just people with a different morality or lack thereof.
Then what makes them different?
They don't seem to have any social mores against taking of human life.
Of the 1,982 men and women on death rows in 1987, 1,020 were white, 814 were black, 113 were Hispanic, 26 were American Indians, and 9 were Asian. 2/3 had a prior felony conviction. 1 out of 11 had a prior homicide conviction. The median age was 32. 62% of them were from southern states. 17% were from the West. 1/3 were married. 40% had never been married. So who is this person on death row?
It's a person who's totally removed themselves from society mentally to where they can actually commit this type of crime, to where they can sit down and make that decision that I'm going to stalk this person, I'm going to lay in wait for this person, and then I'm going to kill this person. Or maybe I'm going to torture this person to death.
The men and women on death row live in isolated cell blocks, segregated from the rest of the prison population. In California, where 219 men reside on death row, their living quarters are spare at best.
Well, the cell is 48 square feet. It's about 4.5 feet wide, about 10 feet 8 inches deep, and the ceiling's about 7 feet 7 inches high. Each one comes with a steel bunk, a toilet, sink, and most every inmate that can afford a TV's got one. They're all made to operate on a headset so they don't disturb each other. Condemned Row was, for the most part, a very quiet, very subdued place. It's getting less and less subdued, where the death penalty used to be a social concept. It's starting to look more and more like a reality.
With California's first execution in 21 years scheduled to take place sometime in 1988, the mood is changing.
We give them plastic eating utensils so that they won't sharpen up their knives and forks and spoons. So they melt plastic eating utensils together and sharpen it up and now have a plastic weapon. There was some knives that were cut out of the supports to the metal bunks. At one time on Condemned Row, there was a man who used to leave a little makeshift weapon, whatever he could put together, one a day out on the floor in front of his cell. And that was just his way of telling us, the administration, that you can lock me up, but you can't control me.
Yet Mark Kinsey, who worked on San Quentin's death row for several years, found a maturity among condemned inmates that didn't seem to exist in the general prison population.
I thought, from my personal views, that they were just a better behaved type of person and went along with the program. It's like a humbling effect. I spent time on death row. I know that I was going to be put to death, and that was something that, even though they know deep down inside that they're probably going to sit there a long time, they're sitting there a long time still knowing that their sentence is death. And someday, the two officers may walk down the corridor, open the cell, and escort them downstairs. Nobody there is any better. No one there is doing 10 to life as opposed to the guy doing 6 to 10, which makes you worse because of your crime. Everybody there is under the sentence of death. So they are all suffering the supreme penalty, and nobody can die but once.
First execution I witnessed happened to be my own cell partner. And I'd celled with this man for 11 months and then seen his death warrant signed. And watched him eating his last meal and watched him shave his head. And quite a shattering experience, being my first execution, also being my cell partner, because I'd gotten to know him so well, just like a brother. And it actually shook me up worse than it shook him up. And having to watch him eat his last meal and everything. And we were so close to the chair at that time that when they executed a man, you could actually smell the flesh burning, you know. And it turned my stomach so bad that I was unable to eat for a couple of days afterwards. Didn't get much sleep, and I still think about it, often have dreams about it. I would say everybody on death row who spends any time on death row has to become a different person, whether better or worse depends on the individual. I myself think I have improved. I've aged, I've matured, I've had time to think and reflect, and it'll change anybody.
When the condemned face death in California, the method of execution is lethal gas, cyanide. And this is where it happens. This is California's gas chamber.
It looks like something that Jacques Cousteau would take to the bottom of the ocean floor. It looks like an old diving bell, actually. It's sort of a dentist chair green. It's got some 2-foot square windows that for the witnesses to the execution to actually see into the chamber. There are 2 seats. The condemned sits with his back to the witnesses.
While on duty at San Quentin, Officer Mark Kinsey once sat in the chair.
The one thing that I remember was how uncomfortable it was. And I always say that. I don't know why. I just, for some reason, didn't think it would be that uncomfortable. It's a real squared type of a chair, short-backed. It's made out of metal, and it's perforated so that the gas can come up through it and make sure that it gets you. It has straps on the arms, along the legs, around the waist, and around the chest, and it's surrounded by windows, and if you look to the right, you can just look right out to where all the witnesses would be standing, and right in front of you is the big door that's hermetically sealed, and just to the left of that are the windows where you can see the clock and the warden, and where the executioner would stand, although he could close some Venetian blinds.
The chamber's closed and sealed, and then the chemicals are mechanically introduced to each other that create the gas. And as soon as the gas reaches the condemned, they're unconscious instantaneously. Mm-hmm. And then depending on their physical makeup, death occurs some minutes after that.
According to government figures, keeping a man on death row costs taxpayers about $20,000 a year. A life sentence of 40 years would be $800,000. An execution can cost up to $3 million because of the lengthy appeals process. Sometimes that takes as long as 10 years.
There is no exhausting of one's appeals. For us to put limitations on the appellate process, we have to make some more sacrifices in this free society. And I don't know what sacrifices you're willing to give up, what constitutional and human rights you're willing to sacrifice to see that these people are pushed a little faster towards execution. Believe it or not, there's people on death row who believe in the death penalty. They don't believe in the death penalty for their particular case because either they still deny that they did it or that they were somehow justified or it was just a fluke of circumstance. They went in to rob the place and just happened to kill some folks in the process. But they certainly support the death penalty when it comes to this guy who disembowels women or who beats to death children or disassembles 2-year-olds with vice grip pliers. I mean, for those folks, yeah, they'd volunteer to pull the lever. Inmates in general have a very low tolerance for people who victimize children. It's nice to see that there's still that bit of morality among them.
Regardless of their feelings toward fellow inmates, the condemned ultimately face their sentence alone. The date of execution traditionally is Friday, Black Friday, and if possible, last requests are honored.
Within reason, they would allow a man to have what he wished, generally speaking, not always. Whatever he wished for a last meal. Of course, if he was living in Massachusetts and requested fresh watermelon in January, there's no way they could give him that. But within reason, they would allow him to. And in some places, you don't, during the entire period of his confinement awaiting death, they would allow him pretty well to have what he wanted to eat. There was one case in the late 1940s in New York, a man named Donald Snyder. Well, he thought he could beat the electric chair by being too fat to sit in it. And he just, while he was on death row for a couple of years, all he did was eat, refused to exercise, and he was enormous when he went to the chair, but they slid him in somehow and electrocuted him.
And there have been some memorable last words.
Well, you had a man named Apple who was executed in the state of New York, and his last words were, "You're about to see a baked apple." Warden Clinton Duffy tells in his book 88 Men and 2 Women about the convict who had killed another convict there in California, and the warden went in to see him shortly before the execution and said, "Is there anything I can get for you, anything particular you want?" And he said, "Well, I would like a pack of Tums. I think I'm going to have gas on my stomach pretty soon."
This green door leads to the gas chamber at San Quentin. The lethal fumes escape through this smokestack. It's through this door that the witnesses, warden, and executioners pass on Black Friday.
Most wardens who had to carry out this function a number of times became passionate opponents of the death penalty. It's not that they were sympathetic toward the criminal. As I stated earlier, it's very hard to feel sympathy for these people, but I think most decent people are compassionate. There was a case in North Carolina where a warden had to electrocute 2 black men on the same day, and he dropped dead of a heart attack about 15 minutes after the last execution. The stress and strain on him is terrible. I know of cases where after conducting executions, wardens have literally, or the people who conducted them, have literally turned to drink and become complete alcoholics.
As the warden puts it, everybody needs to survive the execution except the one being executed. So it takes some fairly strong characters to do the job.
Some states have an executioner who actually pulls the switch, but most will have, for instance, 3 switches to be pulled, and no one will know who actually pulls the lethal switch. The same thing is true in the firing squad. There's a blank fired.
The debate over the morality and effectiveness of capital punishment continues. Even after 300 years of legal executions, both sides of the battle remain fiercely loyal to their beliefs. Is the death penalty an effective deterrent to crime?
On a case-by-case basis, yes, it's 100% effective.
I don't believe the death penalty has any deterrent value whatsoever.
Sure, it serves its purpose, because if they're put to death, they're not out there committing the crime again.
We have any number of cases of children who have committed capital crimes after losing a parent to the executioner.
How do you gauge the success of deterrence? Do we do a telephone poll and say, were you planning on killing someone, and were you deterred when you thought about it again? You see, the special circumstance killers are not your rational, thinking, caring boy next door. It's a person who's totally removed themselves from society mentally to where they can actually commit this type of crime, to where they can sit down and make that decision that I'm going to stalk this person, I'm going to lay in wait for this person, and then I'm going to kill this person.
Another issue is the appeal system.
As a cop, if you're going through a murder trial and somebody gets the death penalty, you naturally think, oh boy, okay, he got what he's got coming. But if you look at it in reality, he may sit on death row the rest of his life, and he's doing exactly what the rest of them will be doing. He's just in prison, serving out his sentence, except that he has that stigma of someday I may be put to death. Most of them know that they're going to go through appeals in the court for year after year after year. It's not a deterrent in that sense, and as long as it's used in that sense, in the punishments, a person's sentenced to death, the appeal processes go through in an expedient manner, and the death sentence is carried out, we're not going to have a death penalty in the United States that is a deterrent.
You'll hear people say, well, he's exhausted all his appeals. There's no such thing as exhausting all your appeals. It's just running out of imagination or sympathetic ears to hear your appellate issues.
But what about the issue of innocence? Watt Espy estimates that in its 300-year history, the death penalty has taken between 200 and 300 innocent lives. He figures that in this century alone, at least 25 men have been wrongly executed.
We've got cases where people were hanged for killing someone, and 3 or 4 years later, the alleged victim turned up alive. Obviously, they were innocent. One of the saddest cases did occur in this century, where a young man was hanged in Nebraska for killing his employer's wife. 3 or 4 years later, the employer on his deathbed confessed that he had murdered his wife. One of the jurors at the trial, which had convicted the young man hanged himself in remorse.
Of all the cases I've looked at, and I've looked at more than I really want to, I can't find an individual that I really think is innocent.
It's inevitable, as long as we have the death penalty, that some innocent persons are going to be executed. I like to think that one of the fundamental differences between our system of government and that of the communist and the other totalitarian forms of government on this planet is the fact that we had rather see 9 guilty not be put to death than that 1 innocent should be, while the others would prefer to see 9 innocents put to death than that 1 guilty not be put to death.
And what about the future of capital punishment in America? While many countries have abolished the death penalty, it still lives in many parts of the world.
Most of our friends and allies all over the world have abolished it, and I think we in time will, but we're a much younger society than most of those are. Canada's abolished it. Even Mexico has abolished it, and I think we will. Possibly by the year 2025, we will have relegated it into the past, and will be something that we're ashamed of, even as we're ashamed of the fact today that we once hanged people for witchcraft, for adultery, for sodomy, for bestiality.
If, in fact, society does have an expectation that the death penalty will be a deterrent, the only way any punishment can be a deterrent is if it's swift and sure. And right now, the death penalty is neither.
Whether the death penalty is abolished or whether it becomes swift and sure, the debate will continue. And America will have the distinction of being one of the most civilized nations in the world to practice one of man's most uncivilized acts. And while experts will continue to search for more humane methods to execute, the result will be the same. Black Friday will leave its mark on the pages of American history.
Now that you guys are off the road, we're not going to cater to you down here. You're going to be on your own. You're expected to conform to the same rules and regulations that you did up there, and there's probably going to be a few different ones. Some of you will be able to move into the honor units if you have enough clean time. But this first week, your day will consist mostly of just going from your cell to breakfast, and lunch, and dinner, and back into your cell. You won't have any free time to play or whatever you have to do. You can take care of some business that you have to take care of that's necessary. On weekends, you'll be able to go to the lower yards, the movies, and
always worries when you've got men that have been involved in dangerous crimes. You've got to overlook the fact that they're likely to repeat that crime. But out of our population of San Quentin now, we have roughly 450 people who are here for homicide conviction of some kind or another. I think they're pretty generally blend into our population. Those that, of course, have been acting out on their own will be not given the opportunity to act out for some time to come.
You'd watch them a bit more closely?
We'll watch them a bit more closely, and if those that have been are either in danger for themselves or we think are constitute a great danger to other people, will be kept under lock and key in spite of the fact that they're no longer under sentence of death or sentence of death or sentence of death.